It started with something small. A cough, a headache, a restless night. In homes across suburban Chicago, people reached for relief in something they trusted. A red and white bottle in a medicine cabinet. The kind you've opened 100 times before. The kind you don't even think about. And they took one capsule, maybe two. And then they collapsed, without warning and without reason. And by the time investigators realized what was happening, the damage was already done. And families were shattered, and entire communities were on edge. And behind it all was an invisible killer hiding in plain sight. This wasn't a spree of gunshots or blood-stained crime scenes. This was something even more terrifying. An unseen, silent, and lethal crime. A crime that snuck its way into the heart of American consumer trust and shattered it overnight. The story you're about to hear is about a nation forced to confront a horrifying question. What if the danger isn't outside your house? What if the danger isn't outside your door, but already inside your home? This is a story of the Tylenol murders. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder. All things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, intellectually beautiful-minded person. That one was for you. And I have my trusted true crime buddy, Roopy Doopy Scoopy Loopy Poopy Poopy. He's sleeping. But today we are talking about one of the scariest cases, and scary because it's just something you use every day, something you would never expect. It's not a person, it's not a cult, it's not somebody coming in and stabbing you, although that is extremely terrifying, or shooting you. It is something unseen. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this insane, crazy, questionable case together. Remember that doctor's appointment you were supposed to make like 3 months ago? Maybe it was that annual overdue checkup that's been 3 years in the making. Or that dermatologist appointment for that weird spot that's been looking a little bit suspicious. And look, I don't know about you, but my entire feed has been filled with health experts telling me that cottage cheese is apparently an entire nutrition plan now, and that I should be chugging olive oil at 6 a.m. for some reason. So let's give the algorithm a rest and turn to actual healthcare professionals who know what they're talking about. And that's where ZocDoc comes in. And honestly, it's been a game changer for me personally. First of all, ZocDoc is a free app and website where you can search and compare high quality in-network doctors and click to instantly book an appointment. You could probably make an appointment right now while I'm doing this segment, honestly. But we're talking over 100,000 doctors across every single specialty, including mental health, dental health, primary care, urgent care, you name it. And you can filter for doctors who take your insurance too, and are nearby, and are highly rated by verified patients. And here's the best part. You can see their actual appointment openings. Pick a time that works for you, and boom, instantly book your visit. And these appointments happen fast, typically within 24 to 72 hours, but most of the time, and in my experience, you can get same-day appointments too. And this is crucial for me personally because my schedule just changes on a whim, especially with my work, and I'm only getting older and I'm starting to forget stuff, to be honest. And speaking of getting older, personally, my past sports injuries have been plaguing me lately. I've been in so much pain. So with ZocDoc, it was super easy to make an appointment and actually get my aches and pains checked out and taken care of. Because you need to take care of yourself. You're important. You're an important little guy, okay? You need to take care of yourself. So I confidently use ZocDoc, and you should too. So stop putting off the doctor's appointments and go to ZocDoc.com/CCCM to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. That's ZocDoc.com/CCCM. ZocDoc.com/CCCM. Thank you to ZocDoc for supporting this channel, and let's get back to it. It's the fall of 1982 in Reagan-era America, a time of suburban boom and optimistic consumer confidence. And families in the Chicago state area start their days with unwavering faith in household brands and their products. And over-the-counter medicines like Tylenol are trusted fixtures in every medicine cabinet. I don't know one person who doesn't have Tylenol in their cabinet, which is what makes this so scary. But they're purchased and used without a second thought. And Johnson & Johnson's extra strength Tylenol is the nation's best-selling pain reliever. It's my go-to, not sponsored. Commanding over 1/3 of the market, which is absolutely insane. I don't know the amount of money that they pull in, but I can't even imagine that number. But in 1982, these capsules came in standard bottles with only a cotton wad under the lid, no safety seals, no plastic wraps, nothing to suggest any danger is inside. And there was just simply no reason to doubt their safety. But that unquestioning trust was shattered on the morning of September 29th, 1982. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up in her family's home in Elk Grove Village, which was a suburb of Chicago. And she would wake up with a runny nose and kind of a sore throat. And Mary herself was a bright and active 7th grader, and she loved horseback riding and babysitting the neighbor kids. And that morning, she felt a bit ill with cold symptoms. So her father, Dennis, offered her one extra-strength Tylenol capsule to help her feel better, like any other day. And Mary took the capsule and went into the bathroom to get ready for school. But moments later, Dennis Kellerman heard a loud thump from the bathroom, and it was the sound of his daughter collapsing. And he would go to say, quote, "I heard her go into the bathroom. Then I heard something drop. I called, 'Mary, are you okay?' And there was no answer. So I opened the door and my little girl was on the floor unconscious. She was still in her pajamas." So Dennis and Gina Kellerman frantically tried to revive Mary and called for an ambulance at 6:33 a.m. So paramedics rushed to the scene and found Mary on the bathroom floor, not breathing and completely unresponsive. And then they would race her to the hospital, attempting CPR and even inserting a pacemaker to restart her heart along the way. But nothing worked. And by 9:30 a.m. that morning, Mary Kellerman was pronounced dead at the hospital. So doctors were stunned, and Mary's parents were absolutely devastated because a 12-year-old sudden death is a rarity, and initial theories struggled to explain it. And at first, the emergency room staff thought Mary might have suffered a stroke or even sudden cardiac event. They were just racking their brains as to anything that could cause a healthy young girl to collapse so abruptly. And police who searched the Kellerman home found nothing amiss, except a few cold remedies on the counter, including the Tylenol bottle Mary had used. And her father had mentioned they had just bought that Tylenol at a local Jewel grocery store just the day before. So the Kellermans were just left baffled and grief-stricken at how their vibrant daughter could be fine one minute and just gone the next. And Mary's tragic death would soon prove to be the first ominous clue in a much larger nightmare. Because later that same morning, another mysterious medical emergency was unfolding in the Chicago suburbs. Adam Janis, aged 27, was a postal worker and a healthy young father of 2 living in Arlington Heights. And Adam woke up that day feeling kind of under the weather, possibly coming down with a cold. So he decided to stay home from work and rest that day. And on his way back from picking up his kids from preschool around lunchtime, Adam stopped at a Jewel grocery store and purchased a bottle of extra strength Tylenol to help with his symptoms. And after returning home with the kids, Adam had lunch and then took 2 Tylenol capsules for his minor aches. And within minutes, something went horribly wrong. And according to later accounts given to Chicago Tribune, after taking the capsules, quote, he walked into his bedroom, collapsed, and fell into a coma. And Adam's wife and family found him unresponsive and would call 911. And Arlington Heights paramedics arrived to find the 27-year-old in critical condition. And they would rush him to Northwest Community Hospital, which was the same hospital that Mary Kellerman went to, just hours earlier, mind you. And Dr. Thomas Kim, the chief of critical care, and his team fought to save Adam's life. But yet again, nothing worked. And the otherwise healthy young man, quote, suffered sudden death without warning, as Dr. Kim later would describe it. So Adam Janus was pronounced dead in the early afternoon around 3:15 p.m., despite no obvious reasons for a fatal collapse. And doctors were utterly confused yet again, because the autopsy revealed no apparent heart attack or aneurysm to explain Adam's cardiopulmonary collapse. So for the second time that day, an otherwise healthy person had simply dropped dead. And the Janus family's heartbreak was compounded by confusion, because how could a 27-year-old and father die so suddenly? So Adam's relatives gathered at his home in Arlington Heights that afternoon, mourning and trying to make sense of this shocking death. But none of them had any idea that Adam's very normal habit of taking Tylenol for a mild ailment had just cost him his life. So the stage was set for an even greater tragedy to strike this family before the day was over. Because as the stunned Janus family got together on September 29th to support one another after Adam's death, the tragedy escalated into unimaginable fashion. Because Adam's younger brother, 25-year-old Stanley Janus, and Stanley's 19-year-old wife, Teresa, arrived at Adam's Arlington Heights home to join the family mourning. And they spent the afternoon with Adam's parents and other relatives, grieving and beginning the sad task of planning Adam's funeral. So emotions were high and the stress was overwhelming. And at one point, Stanley and Teresa both developed throbbing headaches, likely from the shock of all the grief that day. And looking for relief, Stanley went to Adam's bathroom medicine cabinet and found the same bottle of Tylenol that Adam had opened earlier that day. And unaware of the danger, Stanley took some capsules for his headache and offered the bottle to his wife. And Teresa would also swallow one or more Tylenol capsules to dull her pain. And moments later, catastrophe struck the Janus household yet again. So around 5:40 p.m., just hours after Adam died, a frantic call for help went out from the Janus home because Stanley had collapsed without any warning. And allegedly, Stanley had walked into the washroom, then emerged saying, quote, "I don't feel good," before suddenly crumpling into his wife's arms on the kitchen floor. And as relatives screamed, Teresa herself then felt the same sudden onslaught of symptoms. And family members watched in horror as the healthy 19-year-old also collapsed onto the floor, writhing in the same symptoms as her husband. I can't even imagine the shock and pain and just heartache that's happening in this household at this time. Like, it's unimaginable. So in an instant, the Janus family's double tragedy became a triple crisis. So panicked relatives ran for help, and one neighbor who happened to be a nurse rushed over and found both Stanley and Teresa unconscious on the floor. So paramedics would arrive soon after and race the couple to the Northwest Community Hospital, and doctors would fight desperately to revive Stanley, but he, quote, could not be resuscitated despite their best efforts. And at 8:15 p.m. that night, Stanley Janus was pronounced dead, being the second member of the same family to die that day. And Teresa seemed to be slightly more fortunate though, because emergency staff managed to restart her heart and placed her on life support. And she was now in comatose, but alive, thankfully, as they intubated her and put her on a ventilator. And the Janus family, meanwhile, was evacuated from the house under the assumption that something environmental might be the culprit, because still, they'd have no idea at this point. But they would think that it might be something like carbon monoxide poisoning, fearing a toxic leak, and authorities had the remaining relatives taken to the hospital for observation. And a priest even administered last rites to some of them, just in case, which is so scary. But none of the other family members fell ill, thankfully. So whatever struck down Adam, Stanley, and Teresa seemed oddly isolated to those three. So by the end of September 29th, the unbelievable had occurred. 3 otherwise healthy people, 2 from one family, were dead within a matter of hours, and the 4th, Teresa, was in a deep coma. Investigators were dumbfounded, because such a cluster of sudden deaths in one household was almost unheard of outside of scenarios like gas leaks or mass poisoning. Yet initial checks for carbon monoxide came up empty. And nurse Helen Jensen, the Arlington Heights public health nurse on the scene, felt a creeping suspicion as she surveyed the Janus home, because she would notice an open Tylenol bottle and the receipt showing it had been purchased that very day. So when she counted the remaining pills, 6 capsules were missing, and there were 3 victims. And she would say, quote, I said right then and there, it's the Tylenol. And it was a bold hunch, especially for the time. And initially, even the doctors found it hard to believe that a trusted painkiller could be the common thread. But tragically, Nurse Jensen's intuition was about to be proven correct, because Stanley and Teresa Janis had unknowingly taken the same poison medicine that killed Adam. And Stanley never regained consciousness, and Teresa remained on life support for about 2 more days. And unfortunately, she would pass on October 1st, 1982, after failing to recover from the extensive damage done to her body. So Teresa's death brought the toll to 3 members of the extended Janis family and 4 total people lost in a few days. So a joint funeral for Adam, Stanley, and Teresa was held the following week, drawing hundreds of mourners and presided by the Archbishop of Chicago. And the Janis family's unfathomable tragedy was front-page news, and it sounded the alarm to public health officials, because something horribly wrong was happening in Chicagoland, and it was striking people down at random. So as authorities and the public were just beginning to realize that the Janis family deaths were linked, the deadly mystery continued to claim more lives. And among the next victims was Mary Reiner, a 27-year-old homemaker from Winfield, Illinois. And Mary Reiner had just experienced one of life's happiest events, because a few days earlier, she had given birth to her 4th child and returned home from the hospital to be with her growing family. And Mary was happily married to her husband Ed, and together they had 3 children and a newborn infant son. So being a recent postpartum mom, Mary was dealing with the normal aches and pains and fatigue that followed childbirth. And to relieve some of her discomfort, she, like millions of others, turned to Tylenol. And on the morning of Thursday, September 30th, 1982, Mary Reiner took some Tylenol capsules in her kitchen to alleviate minor aches while she went about caring for her infant and her household. And tragically, within minutes, like the others, of taking the medicine, Mary collapsed on the floor in front of her 8-year-old daughter. And Michelle, the little girl, would watch in horror as her mother suddenly fell over and began convulsing uncontrollably. And Mary's husband Ed walked in moments later to a traumatic scene, saying, quote, "I came home right after she had fallen on the floor." And an ambulance was called immediately, and paramedics arrived and raced Mary to Central DuPage Hospital in Winfield. But there was little that they could do. And within hours, Mary Reinfeld was pronounced dead. Just another young, previously healthy person gone in an inexplicable instant. And she would die at roughly 9:03 a.m. on September 30th, barely a day after the first Tylenol-related deaths had begun. Mary's death devastated her family, and Ed Reiner, her husband, was left as a widower, and now tasked with raising 4 children all alone, including a newborn who would never get to know his mother. And the Winfield community was left in shock that a vibrant young mother could be struck down without warning in her own home, without seeming cause. And in the moment, her collapse looked like a sudden medical catastrophe, perhaps a stroke or an aneurysm, but the truth was far worse. She had become the 5th victim. And when investigators later discovered that Mary's Tylenol bottle was also tampered with, it cemented the growing realization that a serial killer was on the loose, using household medicine as a delivery method. So on the evening of September 29th, Mary McFarland was at her job at Illinois Bell Store in Lombard when she developed a sudden severe headache. And she was a 31-year-old telephone company employee from Elmhurst. So going about her day with this really bad headache, she was seeking some sort of quick relief. And she would step into the back room, and she took at least 1 extra strength Tylenol from a bottle that was actually kept at the store. But within minutes of taking the Tylenol, Mary staggered back into the office and collapsed on the floor in front of her coworkers. And paramedics would rush her to Good Samaritan Hospital in Downers Grove, but despite emergency efforts, there was little that they could do, as we know. And Mary McFarland was pronounced dead in the early hours of the next morning, becoming yet another victim of the mysterious Tylenol murders. She was a hard-working single mother, and her sudden death left behind 2 young sons who would have to grow up without their loving mother. And the ordinary act of taking a painkiller for a headache would cost Mary McFarland her life, just further deepening the alarm that was gripping the entire community. And the final known victim of the 1982 Tylenol murders was Paula Jean Prince, who was only 35 years old. And she was a flight attendant for United Airlines who lived in Chicago. But Paula's case showed that the danger was not confined to the suburbs. It had now reached into the city itself. And on September 29, 1982, Paula Prince flew a routine route from Las Vegas back home to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. And she had been fighting off a cold during her travels. And like many travelers feeling under the weather, she decided to pick up some medicine on the way home. So after landing that night, Paula stopped at a Walgreens pharmacy. And there, she purchased a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol. And the transaction was captured by a security camera at the store's ATM, or register area. And in the grainy surveillance image later released to the public, Paula can be seen in her flight uniform patiently buying the Tylenol. But unbeknownst to her, the bottle she was taking home was already death in disguise. So Paula would purchase the Tylenol and drive home. And when she returned to her apartment feeling exhausted from a long day of work, sometime on September 30th, as she prepared to wind down for the evening, Paula took the Tylenol for her cold symptoms before going to bed. And that dose would be fatal. And when friends and family couldn't reach Paula the next day, concerns started to grow. And on October 1st, 1982, just 2 days after her Walgreens purchase, Paula's sister Carol went to her apartment to check on her and made a very grim discovery. Because Paula would be deceased in her bathroom, and she would be found lying on the floor near her vanity. And on the bathroom counter stood the Tylenol bottle she had bought, now open, with one capsule missing. And it was an unmistakable piece of evidence, essentially the smoking gun in the Tylenol case. And the bottle's receipt was still with it, and showed it had been purchased on September 29th from the Walgreens at 1601 North Wells Street in Chicago. And Chicago authorities were now aware that they had a public health nightmare on their hands. Because Paula's death, officially recorded by the medical examiner at 6:45 p.m. on October 1st, brought the known death toll to 7 people over just a few days. And Paula was the only victim who lived within the Chicago city limits, because the others were from outlying suburbs, which initially made it harder to connect the cases. So thanks to very quick detective work by first responders, the link had been made just in time to warn others, as we'll talk about shortly. But for Paula Prince, the warnings came too late, and she never woke up from her final sleep. But with Paula's death, the string of mysterious deaths finally stopped. But only because the connection to Tylenol had been recognized and a massive public alert was underway. So in total, 7 innocent people lost their lives after taking what they thought was normal Tylenol for routine aches and colds. Mary Kellerman, Adam Janis, Stanley Janis, Teresa Janis, Mary Reiner, and Mary McFarland, and Paula Prince. And the normalcy of their actions made the crime all the more terrifying. As one article put it, quote, "Who hasn't taken a Tylenol for quick relief from a headache or cold? The victims' stories are almost universally relatable," which is so true. I take Tylenol way too much, like more than I should. And just the thought of it, like one day killing you out of nowhere, is horrifying. But the discovery of this Tylenol outbreak would create just a wave of panic throughout the public. So by the first days of October 1982, Chicago and the nation were just gripped by fear, because it was now clear that a mass poisoning had occurred, and someone had weaponized a trusted household medicine with lethal intent. So the burning questions remained. What exactly was the poison, and how did it get into the capsules? And who was behind the monstrous act? So in the immediate aftermath of these deaths, investigators from various agencies, including local police, medical examiners, and soon the FBI, scrambled to find the common denominator. And initially, before anyone knew about the tainted Tylenol, each victim's death was attributed to natural or unknown causes. Because Mary Kellerman's was thought to be a stroke or viral infection, and first responders at the Janis home suspected carbon monoxide or other environmental toxin. But as the case piled up on September 29th to September 30th, the pattern began to emerge. And by the morning of September 30th, 2 off-duty firefighters, Richard Keyworth of Elk Grove Village and Lieutenant Philip Capitelli of Arlington Heights, had independently heard emergency radio calls about these strange deaths and compared notes. And both had caught a crucial detail, because in multiple reports, paramedics mentioned that the victims had recently taken Tylenol. And Capitelli would say, quote, "This is a wild stab, but maybe it's the Tylenol," which, as we know, it was. So they passed this hunch up the chain of command, and their warning would reach Dr. Edmund Donahue, the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner of Cook County, and Dr. Thomas Kim at Northwest Community Hospital, who had treated some of the victims. So investigators would quickly gather all of the Tylenol bottles from the Kellerman, the Janus, the Reiner, McFarland, and Prince homes as evidence. And in a pivotal moment, Dr. Donahue gave a simple instruction: open the bottles and smell the contents. Which I feel like that's a little sketchy if you think there's poison in there, but what do I know? I'm just a YouTuber. I don't know anything. So an Arlington Heights investigator, Nick Pichos, did so, pouring out the capsules from the Janus family's Tylenol bottle. And nothing looked obviously odd, as the capsules were intact and unbroken. But he immediately detected a strong odor of bitter almonds coming from the bottle. And when Pichos opened a second Tylenol bottle, which was Mary Kellerman's, he again smelled a same telltale scent: almonds. And that was the eureka moment. Bitter almond odor is the signature of cyanide, which is an extremely deadly chemical poison. And only some people can smell it due to genetic differences, which is horrifying. But fortunately, Pichos and Dr. Donahue could smell it. And they both blurted out the realization at the exact same time, quote, "Cyanide." And lab tests quickly confirmed their worst fears. The Tylenol capsules were laced with potassium cyanide, which is an extremely lethal compound that acts as a potent cellular toxin. And blood tests from the victims came back showing sky-high levels of cyanide in their system, a clear indication of poisoning. So to understand the horror of what happened, one must know what cyanide does to the human body. So cyanide is a chemical asphyxiant, and it poisons the body's cells and prevents them from using oxygen. Essentially, cyanide shuts down the final step of cellular respiration. In other words, a person can be breathing air that has plenty of oxygen, but if cyanide is present, their red blood cells can no longer take in that oxygen to fuel their brain and their other organs. And the result is that vital organs begin to suffocate from within, which again is just, oh my god, so chilling, so horrifying and chilling. And symptoms on set are extremely rapid, and within minutes of ingestion, cyanide causes weakness, dizziness, then seizures and loss of consciousness, and cardiac arrest. So as Deputy Medical Examiner Donahue described it, quote, "It causes brain damage and cardiac arrest. It happens very quickly. And in high doses, death can occur in a matter of minutes," which is exactly what happened to these Tylenol victims. And Dr. Kim noted grimly that the victims, quote, "never had a chance." And in Mary Kellerman's and Mary Reiner's cases, for example, collapse was almost immediate after taking the capsule, and they likely lost consciousness before they even knew that something was wrong. And cyanide was not an unknown poison to authorities. It has a notorious history, in fact. The same toxin has been used in horrifying ways before. During World War II, for example, the Nazis infamously used hydrogen cyanide gas in extermination camps. And many high-ranking Nazi war criminals carried cyanide pills to commit suicide rather than be captured. And cyanide is also the poison that claimed over 900 lives in the Jonestown Massacre of 1978, when cult leader Jim Jones forced his followers to drink cyanide-laced punch, which comes from the quote, "Don't drink the Kool-Aid" or "Don't drink the Flavor-Aid." And if you want to hear more about that case, it's right here. I covered it, and it is absolutely terrifying. And in industry, potassium cyanide has legitimate uses, such as mining and extroplating, but it is highly regulated because even a few grains can kill. So the Tylenol murderer had weaponized cyanide in a particularly sneaky way, by placing it in gel caps of an ordinary drug, ensuring victims would ingest it unknowingly. And the testing of the recovered capsules showed that they contain massive amounts of cyanide, and in some cases, quote, "toxic enough to provide thousands of fatal doses per capsule," which just thinking of a little kid, a mother, all these people ingesting something that could potentially kill thousands. Like how, I don't know, you can't help but like think of like a loved one, this happening to them, and it's just so incredibly bleak and horrifying. So the killer had packed each capsule with far more poison than necessary to guarantee death, and investigators now understood what had killed the victims. So the next pressing questions were how and when the capsules had been contaminated. And crucially, when officials traced the lot numbers and origins of the Tylenol bottles, they made a startling discovery, because the affecting bottles came from different production plants and different lot batches. Mary Kellerman's bottle and Janice's bottle shared one lot number, MC2880, but Mary Reiner's and Paula Prince's bottles were from other lot codes. So it confirmed that the factories producing those batches were located in Pennsylvania and Texas, yet all the deaths were in the Chicago area. So this would strongly indicate that the poisoning did not happen at a single factory or during manufacturing, which would have caused a more geographically dispersed tragedy. But instead, the pattern suggested that someone had tampered with the bottles locally after they had been shipped to the retailers. So investigators theorized that the culprit or culprits went into one or more pharmacies or grocery stores in the Chicago metropolitan area, likely in the weeks leading up to September 29th, and quietly placed the poison in the capsules. And the killer may have bought several bottles of Tylenol off the shelf, taken them home to contaminate them with the capsules with cyanide powder, and then secretly returned the bottles back to the store shelves to await unsuspecting victims. And at first glance, this seemed extremely difficult, because how could someone open a Tylenol bottle and tamper with the capsules and then put it back without anyone noticing? But in 1982, there were no tamper evidence seals on pill bottles, and extra strength Tylenol capsules came in standard screw top containers with nothing but a cotton plug under the cap. So one could peel off the outer box's glue or lift the lid and manipulate the contents and then simply shut it again and forget about it. And the bottles themselves did not have shrink wrap or foil seals either. And those innovations were a direct result of this crime, which is insane to think about, that nobody would think about, like properly sealing off drugs. Just crazy. So each contaminated capsule had been opened and filled with cyanide, which appears as a white crystal-like powder similar to sugar, then carefully reassembled so as to look normal. And some capsules later showed slight distortions, like the red half of the capsule on a few were discolored and bulging, likely from the corrosive cyanide inside. But a consumer picking up a bottle would obviously not know about that warning or that it was contaminated with, especially under distressing symptoms. And also there were no seals to break, so that wouldn't be evident. There would only be that faint smell of almonds that, as we know, not everybody can even smell. And even if they could, how would they know that it's cyanide? It's very little known knowledge. I mean, not now. Now you know. So do with that what you will. So by October 1st, 1982, the connection between all the deaths was conclusively made. Extra strength Tylenol capsules laced with potassium cyanide were the cause. And this realization triggered one of the most urgent public warnings in modern history. And law enforcement and health officials scrambled to alert the public in the Chicago area and beyond, essentially telling everyone to stop taking Tylenol immediately. And police cars in Chicago drove through neighborhoods using loudspeakers to warn residents, saying, "Do not take Tylenol." And firefighters and volunteers used bullhorns and even went door to door in some areas to spread the alarm. And emergency press conferences were held. And on the afternoon of Thursday, September 30th, the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office held a press conference to announce that they had found cyanide in Tylenol capsules, and to warn the public that Tylenol could be very, very dangerous. And that very evening, all three national TV networks led with the story on the evening news. And citizens would respond immediately, and many would rush to throw out any Tylenol that they had or turn it into police. And hospitals in Chicago were flooded with panic calls. One hospital even got 700 calls in a single day just from worried people. Because people didn't know what to expect. Like, they didn't know if they took the Tylenol that it would take a while or if it would take minutes. They had no idea. I can't even imagine the panic and anxiety that the public had. And poison control centers nationwide were drowning with inquiries from people wondering if their headache or nausea was cyanide poisoning. And the fear and confusion were unlike any caused by a consumer product in US history. And even as the public was being warned, a massive law enforcement investigation kicked into high gear to hunt down the perpetrator. And the coordination between agencies was unprecedented at the time. And the FBI quickly joined forces with the local police departments from all affected communities, which were Arlington Heights, Elk Grove Village, Schaumburg, Lombard, and Chicago, as well as the Illinois State Police and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, which is the FDA. So a multi-agency task force of detectives and federal agents was formed, operating under the FBI's lead since product tampering could fall under federal jurisdiction. And their immediate goal was to figure out where and how the bottles had been poisoned and gather any clues to identify who did it. So investigators meticulously mapped the distribution of cyanide-laced Tylenol bottles, and they identified a handful of stores in the Chicago area where the victims, or the families, had bought their Tylenol. A Jewel supermarket in Arlington Heights for Adam Janis's bottle, another Jewel store for Mary Kellerman's, a Walgreens in Winfield for Mary Reiner's, and a drugstore in Elk Grove, and a Walgreens on North Wells Street in Chicago for Paula Prince's. And notably, all of the tampered bottles were found, as we know, in the greater Chicago metropolitan area, and nowhere else. So Johnson & Johnson, the manufacturer, cooperated fully and quickly provided distribution records, and they confirmed that there was no single shipment or single lot that linked all the stores, meaning that the killer likely traveled to several different stores to plant poison bottles, just to further confuse authorities, I'm going to safely assume. So the FBI would find no signs of tampering at the manufacturing plants themselves. So it became clear that the retail shelf was the crime scene. And as one FDA official put it, the working theory was that an unknown individual, quote, bought extra-strength Tylenol over the counter, inserted cyanide in some of the capsules, then returned the bottles to the store shelves. And this notion of random poisoning at the consumer level was both terrifying and logistically challenging for investigators, because they were essentially dealing with a random murderer who chose victims not by who they were, but by which bottle they happened to buy. It was like a big nightmare mystery bottle. And as Illinois Attorney General Ty Fanner said, it was akin to an act of domestic terrorism, which it absolutely was. And he would say, quote, "This was totally random. Put the deadly poison in commerce and see who drops. Very, very frightening." And crime scene technicians dusted the returned bottles and capsules for fingerprints and other trace evidence. And each capsule they would find was handled with extreme care as both deadly evidence and a potential clue. The task force preserved some of the poison capsules, hoping one day improved forensic might pull a usable fingerprint or DNA sample from them, because the technology at the time wasn't that great. Because unfortunately, the killer had been very cunning here too. There were no identifiable fingerprints found on the capsule, outside of the bottle, or inside the bottle. And even if the perpetrator didn't wear gloves, any prints were smudged beyond any sort of use. And likewise, forensic analysis of the cyanide itself yielded very little, because cyanide is a common industrial chemical, and this particular formulation didn't point to a unique source. And along with the recall from Johnson & Johnson, more on that later, law enforcement conducted hundreds of interviews and followed thousands of leads. And they examined recent sales records looking for anyone who might have bought Tylenol in bulk or who had suspiciously returned the Tylenol bottles to the stores. So they would investigate disgruntled employees at Tylenol factories and distribution centers, and psychologists attempted to profile the type of person who would commit such a strange and motiveless crime. And as one FBI criminal analysis said, normal guidelines, quote, just don't work on a killer this unusual. Because usually there's a pattern. Usually there's an MO, a modus operandi, a style of murder, if you will. They like a blonde girl with blue eyes, or a teenage boy with brown hair, or there's just something, you know, a certain type of a lady of the night. There's usually some sort of pattern, but here it was just free up chaos. So with no obvious personal motive or connection between killer and victims, it was truly a needle in a haystack situation. And the daunting reality was summed up by an FDA deputy commissioner saying, quote, "There is no way to protect the public from people who do such things." And still, the task force pressed on relentlessly, checking anyone with even a remote connection to cyanide or Tylenol. And by the end of 1982, they had zeroed in on a few potential suspects. And one name in particular would soon rise to infamy in connection with the Tylenol case. So on October 6, 1982, amid the chaos of ongoing investigation and media frenzy, an alarming letter arrived at the headquarters of Johnson & Johnson's Tylenol's manufacturer. And the anonymous letter took responsibility for the Tylenol killings and made a disturbing demand, effectively stating, quote, "If you want to stop the killing, pay me." So it was essentially a ransom note from someone claiming to be the poisoner, attempting to extort money in exchange for public safety. And the letter provided a bank account number at Chicago Bank where the money should be deposited. So law enforcement treated it with the utmost seriousness, of course, and they traced the bank account to a man named James W. Lewis, who became a person of interest. And the bank account was not his, but instead was his wife's ex-employer, whom they had a falling out with. So on October 13th, 1982, the FBI released photos and a description of Lewis and his wife, Leanne. And James William Lewis, a 36-year-old man with a checkered past, would soon become the prime suspect in the Tylenol murders. And Lewis had actually left the Chicago area shortly before the poisonings began. And when his extortion letter was made public, a nation manhunt ensued. And Lewis and his wife would be spotted in New York City in December of 1982. And the FBI arrested James Lewis in a New York library after a 2-month search. And under interrogation, Lewis admitted to writing that extortion letter, but he denied being the actual Tylenol poisoner. I mean, yeah, it's like red flag. It's like somebody's just taking advantage of this horrible crime that has happened, just trying to extort money for it. It's awful, but it seems too obvious. And he would claim that he was merely trying to embarrass his wife's former employer. Also that, I mean, they had a falling out, so it's like, what can I do to ruin this person's life? Oh yeah, put them in jail for their entire lives for killing 7 innocent people. It's like, what the f***? And the bank accountant in the extortion letter was registered with the travel agency she used to work at. But regardless of his claims, Lewis was charged federally, not with the murder, but with extortion for the threat in the letter. And in 1984, he was convicted and eventually sentenced to 10 years in prison. And he ultimately served about 12 years, including a pretrial detention for the crime. Which, like, yeah, go f yourself, you piece of shit. But James Lewis's background made him an intriguing and ominous figure. He was a native to Missouri, and Lewis was seemingly intelligent, reportedly a tax preparer by trade, but had a history of mental instability and violence. And in 1978, he was arrested and charged with the gruesome murder in Kansas City. And this murder was a former client of his, which was an older man named Raymond West, and had been found dismembered in his attic. Just a casual Tuesday murder, like what? And the evidence pointed to Lewis, including a forged check from West's account that Lewis tried to cash. However, those murder charges were dropped on a legal technicality because police had failed to read Lewis his Miranda rights properly, so key evidence was thrown out, which is crazy. So Lewis walked free, and by 1982, Lewis harbored various grudges, and he claimed that Johnson & Johnson had manufactured a heart patch for infants and caused the death of his young daughter years earlier. And this, Lewis said, drove him to seek revenge by writing the extortion letter to Johnson & Johnson out of extreme grief and anger. And all of these convoluted motives and past incidences made Lewis appear quite capable of the Tylenol murders, which, you know, it makes sense. Like, the extortion makes sense as just some random person trying to extort, but it also makes sense, especially with, there is some motives there, you know? But however, despite being the only person ever indicted in connection with the Tylenol case, James W. Lewis was never charged with the actual murders because law enforcement agencies simply couldn't find concrete physical evidence tying him to the tampered bottles. In fact, they could not even place Lewis in the Chicago area at the time of the poisonings. And records show that he had actually left Illinois for New York a few weeks before late September of 1982. So it just didn't line up. And no witnesses or surveillance could connect him to the stores in question either. So the FBI searched Lewis's residence and belongings in 1982 and decades later. for any trace of cyanide, Tylenol capsules, or even a single Tylenol bottle, but found nothing conclusive. But they did find drafts of the extortion letter in his home and books about poisonings, which certainly suggest he was at least studying how to poison people, I guess. But being willing to exploit the crime and being the one who carried it out are very separate things. So in court, Lewis stuck to his story that he only wrote the letter for money and had nothing to do with the actual murders themselves, saying, quote, "I wouldn't hurt anybody. What about that guy in your attic? What the f?" And he would insist this with a chuckle later in an interview, maintaining that if someone could read his mind, they'd find nothing incriminating. Sounds concrete to me, buddy. I mean, I don't know if you did it or not. He seems kind of crazy. If you watch him in interviews, you're like, this guy did it for sure. But there's no evidence. And it's just, I don't know. Different time, though. Didn't have a lot of forensic stuff back in the 80s. So could he have done it? Maybe. Could he have not? Maybe. I don't know. But Lewis would serve his 12 years in federal prison for extortion and was released in 1995. And after his release, he actually moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he lived quietly for many, many years. But he never escaped the shadow of suspicion. And the Tylenol task force periodically revisited him as their top suspect. And in 2007 to 2010, with the 25th anniversary of the case, the investigation was renewed, and authorities conducted new interviews and applied modern forensic techniques. And in 2010, the FBI and local police famously searched Lewis's home in Cambridge, seizing a computer and other items, though the exact purpose was not fully disclosed at the time. But no charges followed that search, indicating no definitive link was established. And as recently as 2022, investigators traveled to Massachusetts to interview James Lewis again on camera. And through it all, Lewis continued to deny any involvement in the murders at all. And prosecutors never felt that they had enough evidence to indict him for the murders. So you could just feel the frustration for law enforcement. And one former prosecutor said upon Lewis's death, quote, "I was saddened, not because he's dead, but because he didn't die in prison." Agreed. And this was a blunt statement, reflecting their strong belief that Lewis was guilty of more than extortion, which, I don't know, maybe. It just seems like such a stupid plan to me to do all of that and then get it traced to a bank account, which they could obviously trace back to him. It just, he's supposed to be the smart guy. It just doesn't seem smart. But the extortion itself is really not smart. So, I mean, maybe he is that stupid. I don't know. But James W. Lewis died on July 9th, 2023 at the age of 76, and he would be found unresponsive in his Cambridge home from natural causes. And police determined there was nothing suspicious about his death, and with his passing, the chief suspect in the Tylenol murders was gone. And many in law enforcement still quietly believe he was the Tylenol killer, citing his demonstrated knowledge of poisonings, his criminal past, and the fact that he inserted himself into the case via the extortion scheme from day one. And others, however, acknowledge the possibility that Lewis may have just been an opportunist, just a cruel, manipulative man who saw the headlines and decided to cash in with a copycat threat, but not the original murderer. But the truth remains uncertain. And to date, James William Lewis is the only person who has ever been charged in relation to the Tylenol case at all. And that was for the letter. And no one has been charged or convicted for the actual cyanide murders as of 2025. So the case remains officially unsolved with an open investigation. And it is worth noting that though Lewis was the primary suspect, he wasn't the only suspect over the years. Another early suspect, for example, was a man named Roger Arnold, a man who bizarrely boasted in a bar about how to kill people with cyanide. And Arnold was intensely investigated in 1982 and even had some circumstantial links because he worked at the jewel store warehouse that Mary Reiner's father had worked at, but no evidence panned out. And Arnold was never charged in the Tylenol case. And tragically, Arnold later had a breakdown from the stress of being a suspect and shot an innocent man in 1983, whom he mistook someone who had tipped the police about him for. And for that murder, Roger Arnold went to prison for 30 years. And his story just became a disturbing footnote to the Tylenol saga, showing how the ripple effects of suspicion ruined additional lives. However, the enduring focus always comes back to James Lewis. And in the end, Lewis's conviction for extortion at least provided a sense that someone was held accountable in some way, I guess. because he served time and the killings did stop after his arrest. But correlation is not proof, obviously. And the FBI and local police never closed the case, hoping for a break or a confession that just never came. And the Tylenol killer, if it wasn't Lewis, had literally gotten away with murder or murders. And if it was Lewis, he managed to outlast the pursuit. But the lingering uncertainty is just torment for victims' families and investigators alike. And the horror of the Tylenol murders had one unfortunately predictable outcome. It inspired a wave of copycats throughout the 1980s. Because in the immediate aftermath of the Chicago deaths, authorities around the country began receiving reports of other food and medicine that had been tampered with. And the FDA counted more than 270 different reported incidents of product tampering in just the month following the Tylenol poisonings. The Tylenol killer had opened a sort of Pandora's box of ideas for extremely disturbed and up individuals. And one of the most notorious copycats occurred in 1986 in Washington. Because in 1986, 2 people in the Seattle area died suddenly after taking extra strength Excedrin, another over-the-counter pain capsule. And their names were Bruce Nichol and Susan Snow. And investigators would find cyanide in their Excedrin capsules, immediately recalling the Tylenol murders method. But this time, however, the truth was uncovered and the culprit was caught. And Stella Nichol, Bruce's wife, had laced 6 bottles of Excedrin with cyanide in an elaborate plot to kill her husband for insurance money, which is disgusting. Willing to kill other people just to make sure that your husband's dead. Like, that is next level evil. Because she tried to make it look like a random product tampering. But she deliberately placed the extra poison bottles on store shelves to kill strangers, which is how Susan Snow, an innocent customer, died, in order to cover up the murder of her husband, which again, just evil. And Stella Nichol's own daughter eventually tipped off the authorities, and evidence of her library research into poisons sealed the case, thankfully. And in 1988, Stella Nichol was convicted on 2 counts of murder and became the first person found guilty under the new federal Anti-Tampering Act. And she would receive 2 90-year prison sentences. And the Nichol case proved that the ghost of Tylenol-like crimes was very, very real. Because someone had literally copycatted the idea using cyanide in pain capsules to kill for personal motive. And there were other incidents as well. And in 1986, the same year as the Excedrin case, a woman in Yonkers, New York, died from cyanide-laced Tylenol capsules. And despite the fact that by 1986, Tylenol bottles had new safety seals, that case was never solved and just raised disturbing questions about whether the original Tylenol killer might have struck again or if it was yet another copycat. And in 1991, in Washington state again, cyanide was placed in Sudafed, which is cold medicine capsules, by a man named Joseph Mailing. And he had killed 2 people, Kathleen Denneker and Stanley McCorder, and put his wife, Jennifer Mailing, into a coma. But she did fortunately recover, which thank God. And Joseph would be sentenced to life imprisonment. The Tylenol murders also cast a long shadow over American culture, perhaps most ironically in how we view Halloween candy. Although myths about poisoned Halloween candy were around before 1982, the Tylenol case happening 1 month before Halloween just turbocharged those fears. And that year, some communities just outright canceled trick-or-treating, and many parents just forbade their kids from eating any treats that weren't fully sealed from the store. And there were reports of pins and needles found in candy bars that Halloween. So this public anxiety was just a direct legacy of the Tylenol terror, and the fear that anyone, anywhere could randomly poison a product on a shelf or a treat given to a child was horrifying. And the idea of tamper-proofing became a national obsession, and supermarkets started keeping medicines either behind the pharmacy counter or in locked cases for a time. And consumers would inspect bottles and packaging for any sign of meddling. And the naive trust of grabbing a box off the shelf was just gone overnight. And though there were over 270 copycat incidents reported to the FDA, it turned out that about 3 dozen of them were legitimate. And the rest were hoaxes or issues incorrectly identified and linked to a drug taken. And companies faced extortion attempts by criminals claiming to have poisoned food and drugs, forcing those products off the shelves until tested. So it was essentially product terrorism that played on the public's fear. And the country had to respond not only by hunting down the perpetrators, but also by completely overhauling consumer safety protocols to restore trust. And in the midst of this nightmare, one company found itself in the glaring spotlight, and that was Johnson & Johnson, the parent of Tylenol's manufacturer, McNeil Consumer Products. And the action Johnson & Johnson took in response to the crisis has since become a legendary case study in effective and ethical crisis management. It can be argued that Johnson & Johnson wrote the playbook on corporate responsibility during a disaster, turning a potential public relations catastrophe into a tale of transparency and consumer safety first. Which has a big drug brand that seems pretty bottom of the barrel. I have no sympathy for the big drug companies. Are you kidding me? Because when the poisonings were first recognized, Johnson & Johnson executives were stunned, obviously, because Tylenol was their flagship product, accounting for a huge share of their revenue, because Tylenol was bringing in around $300 million annually by 1982. There you go, there's your number. And the initial instinct could have been to protect the brand above anything else, but Johnson & Johnson's leadership, guided by its famous corporate credo prioritizing customers, asked two fundamental questions. One, how do we protect the people? And two, how do we save this product? In that order, which is good. It's not the other one before the other one, because the other one matters a lot more. And they realized the only way to save the product was to first protect people and be honest. And the company immediately issued public warnings as soon as they were informed that cyanide was found. And they didn't wait for definitive proof or try to minimize the issue. And by Wednesday night, September 29th, and into Thursday, September 30th, Johnson & Johnson was actively cooperating with authorities and cautioning consumers not to take the Tylenol. And they halted all Tylenol advertising to avoid encouraging any use of the product. And they actually had set up a 1-800 hotline so frightened customers could actually call Johnson & Johnson directly to ask questions or get refunds. And they also established a separate hotline for media to keep information flowing outwards and had executives available for interviews whenever they needed. So this openness was unusual at the time, especially because many companies in crisis just go silent and issue lawyerly statements. But Johnson & Johnson CEO James Burke became the public face of response, expressing sympathy for the victims and commitment to solving the problem, which again, bare minimum. By the way, everybody's like, yay, he's being a decent human being. Wow, he's not just keeping it a secret. He's actually trying to save people's lives. I mean, good on him, like great person, but also like just bottom of the barrel. But the most significant action, of course, was Johnson & Johnson's decision to recall every bottle of Tylenol capsules nationwide. And this recall went far beyond what was legally required, as initially only certain lot numbers in Chicago were suspected, obviously, as we know. And on October 5th, 1982, J&J announced the voluntary recall of all Tylenol in capsule form across the United States. And an estimated 31 million bottles were pulled off store shelves and out of medicine chests at a cost of over 100 million, which was about 300 million at the time, to the company. And this was an enormous financial hit. But Johnson & Johnson chose consumer safety over profit and brand image. And in doing so, ironically, saved the brand's image long term, which I think was the plan. So the public and media widely praised J&J's swift, decisive recall as the responsible move. And the company also offered to give full refunds, no questions asked. I don't know, it's just like funny to me. It's just like, hey, so we have a bunch of bottles that could kill you and you can get your $2.99 back. It's on me. So by November 1982, even before the case was solved, Johnson & Johnson was taking steps to ensure such a tragedy could never happen again with their products, which awesome. And in a bold innovation, they actually redesigned the Tylenol's packaging from the ground up. And they introduced what became known as a triple seal tamper-evident packaging. And this consisted of a glue flaps outer box, a tight plastic shrink band around the bottle cap, and a foil seal over the mouth of the bottle under the cap. So if any of those three seals was broken, a consumer would know not to use the product. And additionally, J&J moved away from the easily openable powder capsules and started pushing Tylenol in solid caplet form, which is genius. Like that's the way you do it. They were extremely innovative and I applaud them for that. And these were way harder to tamper with without any sort of detection. And in November, just 2 months after the murders, Tylenol was reintroduced to the market in this new packaging, accompanied by heavy promotions and deep discounts to entice customers back. And the company also pioneered public service announcements about checking for tampering and working with the FDA to develop industry-wide standards. And this whole J&J thing was referred to as remarkable public relations reaction that put public safety first, because many expected the Tylenol brand to be doomed after this, obviously, because early polls in October showed consumer confidence in Tylenol had collapsed, and its market share plunged from about 35% to only 8% overnight, which is really bad. Really bad, stock member bros. Yet, because of J&J's honesty and the effective changes they implemented, Tylenol remarkably rebounded. And within a year, Tylenol's market share climbed back above 30%, nearly as high as before. And within a few years, it was once again the top pain reliever in America. And by May 1983, just 8 months later, millions of consumers had returned to the brand. And this was a testament to the public's appreciation of J&J's integrity and tangible safety measures now in place. In fact, many consumers actively chose Tylenol because of the new tamper-evident packaging, which soon became the industry norm. Which, yeah, thank God. But aside from the business recovery, J&J's handling of the crisis had a broader impact, and it directly influenced the passage of new laws. Like in 1983, the US Congress unanimously passed what was nicknamed the Tylenol Bill, which was a federal anti-tampering act signed into law in October of 1983. And this law made it a federal crime to maliciously tamper with consumer products, with harsh penalties that were up to life imprisonment if death resulted. And before tampering was not clearly defined in federal statutes, but after 1983, it became one of the most serious crimes in the books, reflecting the nation's resolve to deter would-be copycats. And Johnson & Johnson obviously supported this legislation, and by 1989, the FDA had developed regulations that required tamper-evident features on all over-the-counter medications. So in other words, those little plastic seals and foil liners we take for granted on medicine bottles, and even some food or drink bottles, largely came about because of the Tylenol murders, and I'm thankful for it. So the entire pharmaceutical industry just had to redesign all of their packaging. And capsules were made less readily accessible, and some companies even temporarily discounted capsules in favor of solid pills. And J&J also ran educational campaigns to regain trust, emphasizing their new safety measures and encouraging people to trust Tylenol again under the taglines like, quote, "We've worked hard to gain your trust, we'll work even harder to keep it." And over time, the Tylenol case became a textbook example of doing the right thing under pressure. Where some corporations might have downplayed or delayed, Johnson & Johnson's was transparent and human-centric. Who would have thunk? But it's sobering that it took such a tragedy to spur these safety innovations, but the result was a new model. Consumers demanded and got tamper-resistant packaging and better corporate accountability. But despite all the improvements in safety and successful crisis response by Johnson & Johnson, one haunting fact remains. The Tylenol murderer was never caught, and the case has loomed over law enforcement for 4 decades as one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in American history. And for the families and victims, this lack of closure has been deeply painful, and they have never seen justice served for their loved ones. No day in court, no conviction, only endless unanswered questions. And the children of victims like Mary McFarland and Mary Reiner grew up without mothers and with the knowledge that someone somewhere essentially got away with murdering them. And investigators too have been frustrated by the case's elusiveness because the original task force worked around the clock through late 1982 and 1983. Chasing leads eventually fizzled out. And in the following decades, advances in forensic sciences like DNA profiling prompted authorities to re-examine the old evidence. And in 2007, the FBI and local police formed a new task force to reopen the case, computerizing all the old case files and retesting items in the evidence vault. And they interviewed witnesses, again with fresh eyes, and they even brought in experienced cold case investigators and criminal profilers. But ultimately, the physical evidence available did not yield a smoking gun, and no detectable DNA from the perpetrator could be lifted, which is perhaps Not surprising, given the poison and time passed. Fingerprint technology had improved a lot, but still no match was found for the partial prints on the bottles. And the consensus remained that it's an open mystery. And after Lewis's death in 2023, officials in Illinois stated that the case remains active. However, without new evidence or a confession, a prosecution is very unlikely, unfortunately. And there are also lingering uncertainties about the extent of the crime itself. For instance, how many bottles were actually tampered with. The known count is very small, only half a dozen or so tainted bottles were ever found conclusively. And given that 31 million bottles were in circulation, it's terrifying to think the killer needed to contaminate only a few to cause nationwide terror. So it's possible that there were other poison bottles out there that simply never got purchased, or if purchased, were promptly discarded during the recall before harming anyone. But to this day, we don't definitively know whether it was just a handful of bottles or much more, or if the person acted alone or with assistance. And additionally, some investigative reporters and even a recent documentary have given alternative theories. And one theory being that they explored whether someone inside the supply chain could have been responsible. For example, a rogue employee at a distributor or warehouse who had access to multiple lots, which could explain the differing lot numbers. And a Netflix documentary in 2023 pointed out that 2 primary production lots involved, while made in different factories, both ended up in the Chicago area, possibly via the same distribution center. And this led to speculative questions. Could it have been a horrendous accident or an inside job that was covered up? Johnson & Johnson has repeatedly denied that scenario, obviously, and the prevailing view remains that it was a malicious retail-level tampering. But such questions linger in the absence of a proven culprit. And on a broader scale, the cultural fallout of the Tylenol murders was significant and enduring. And Americans' relationships with consumer products fundamentally changed, as we know. And at the end of the day, the victims were just ordinary individuals doing something we all do, seeking a little relief from a headache or cold or some pain. And because of one person's unfathomable actions, 6 families were shattered. And the randomness made it just especially cruel. And the poisoner had no idea and didn't care who would end up ingesting the tainted capsules. It was essentially a serial killing with a roulette wheel of targets. The case just continues to fascinate and haunt. It's a reminder that sometimes real life is scarier than any fiction. So the legacy of the Tylenol murders lives on, just etched in the packaging on every pharmacy shelf, in the collective memory of a nation that vowed never to let such a crime happen so easily again. And that is the end of this case. Well, hopefully not the end. I pray that one day we can figure out who did this, but it is extremely unlikely, and my heart goes out to the families. I can't even imagine. It's just horrifying and horrible, but that is the case. And if you have other cases that you want me to deep dive into, let me know down below. I always read the comments, and until then, I will see your beautiful face, okay? Bye. Also, stay safe.